All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us again at History's Three Sides. We got Chris joining us today. We haven't seen Ben yet, but that's okay. If he joins us, he joins us. If not, well, it's just me and Chris. So we're going to continue on with our discussion about special education today. Today we're going to focus more on the legislation, IDEA, IDEA and ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and IDEA. So Chris, you want to give us an explanation on what those are?
Okay. So last week we kind of looked at kind of the whole grassroots, the whole kind of how the culture evolved around disability in the United States and things. So with all of that movement, we finally started seeing, I think, the groundwork laid for special education in schools. Brown versus Board said, hey, look, separate is not equal, which a lot of special education advancements really piggybacked a lot on that early civil rights legislation and those civil rights cases. So it really wasn't until 1975 that we finally see the first piece of federal legislation, special education law passed in the United States when they passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Whenever I talk about this stuff, I always kind of use a restaurant analogy. And what this first Handicapped Children Act did was it opened the door and allowed us into the restaurants. It allowed us into the schools. What it says was that special education services were to be made acceptable. They became required, that we must maintain a fair and appropriate services for the children with disabilities. That there must be an institute systematic evaluation requirements. And that we finally got federal resources committed. Little side note, one thing that we do see, however, unfortunately, and this is not the first time we'll see, it's not the last time, every piece of legislation from the feds has some kind of financial or funding component to it. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the years is that they've not been very forthcoming of paying the states that money. So there's a lot of unfunded mandates, which has caused a lot of, I think, the reluctancy and the slowness of some school districts and states to fully implement this stuff. It's like, hey, wait a minute, we don't have the resources, we don't have the money. We always hear that in education. That's always kind of a fallback for a lot of this, unfortunately. So 1975, this gets passed. This brings up leads to one of the first big special education Supreme Court with the Raleigh decision. And for a lot of us in education, you'll kind of hear to it always referred as the Raleigh test. Does the services being provided for this child, basically, are they fair and appropriate education for this child?
It kind of leads to least restricted environment.
Yes, which is interesting because that really doesn't get mentioned in this first piece of legislation, which caused parents to.
It's not really mentioned, but you can see where it's forming the basis.
Absolutely, and again, it goes back to that grassroots nature of this, the parents and advocates stepping up and saying, hey, it's great, you opened up the doors, you let us in the building, but we're still not getting access to things. We're still not getting access to full inclusion or the art classes, electives, those kind of things.
Right.
It wasn't until 1990 when they passed IDEA, which was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that we finally get this idea of least restrictive environment, and it's not just enough to let them in the door. It's not just enough to say, oh, look, they have the special ed wing over here, which unfortunately happened a lot of times. You know, our kids got put in the basements. They got there still was a little bit of this segregation issue with special education a lot. Then it gets really, then we get into a very mucky, and I don't want to hover on this for too long because there's other things we want to discuss. Then came the whole accountability issue. And like I said last week, the feds warned us, if you're not going to be accountable and give us some kind of measure that you're actually teaching kids, we're going to step in. And unfortunately, when that's allowed to happen, a lot of people who have no real education background get to start making the decisions. And that's when we get the whole No Child Left Behind Act. And one of, I think, the big unintended consequences as we look back hindsight with this is that it introduced the whole graduation qualifying exam, GQE, or EC, what were they called? End of course assessments, ECAs.
ECAs.
The unintended consequence of what that did, a couple big areas that impacted. One, if you had a child that is truly mild or moderately impaired, those tests are almost impossible for them to pass, which led to the huge boom of non-diploma track kids and certificate of completion. Because the dirty game that got played in this, and our kids became victims of this, principals and administrators and districts got so concerned about, if we don't meet our growth number, we're going to lose federal funding.
Yep.
One of the ways that they could boost that number was by putting kids on certificate track where they didn't count against their graduation rates. And they didn't count against testing numbers.
Well, that's the other thing with that is that's where you started seeing a boom in standardized testing.
Yes.
And that is, if you ask any teacher, that is a bane to education.
Yeah. I remember looking at some of our testing calendars, and you couldn't go between the benchmark testing or the state assessments. You couldn't go more than 2 or 3 weeks without some kind of formalized assessment being done. It's like, holy shnikes.
And it's still almost being done that way.
Yeah. So No Child Left Behind also realized it was also set on a very faulty premise. Now, I'm no statistician or no math genius here. You're the one who teaches math, so you tell me where this is faulty. 100% of kids will be above average.
Not possible.
That was a No Child Left Behind statement.
Not possible.
But I agree, but that was what No Child Left Behind was based on.
How do you have everybody above average and then still have an average?
You just raised what average is. And unfortunately,
there's a certain point where you can't increase anymore.
I mean, most people would agree in our field that you're going to have roughly 3 to 8% of your population that is going to be moderately or severely impacted, special needs.
Well, a big part of No Child Left Behind, though, was, and this was the part where I disagreed with. I was a big opponent of No Child Left Behind because of this aspect, and that was the when you got a school that's rated as a 95, and every school has to show a certain percentage of growth. Once you're up to that point, you can't show that percentage. So now you're a school that has a 95 or 96 rating, but you're considered a failing school because you didn't meet your growth. And it was like, what? how, wait a minute, and those schools are being punished for not meeting their growth, but they're some of the top schools in the country. So it was like, what? How? That was a fault of No Child Left Behind.
Well, and I think looking back on it, what all the other um, uh-oh.
Yeah, I'm still here. I hit something by mistake.
I think one of the other things looking back that it also opened the door for was the whole charter school movement.
Oh,
And I'm going to say this as bipartisan, nonpartisan as I can. In this environment, people are always very quick to point blame of, oh, that's a Republican issue, that was a Democrat created issue. I'm going to sit here and publicly tell you, No Child Left Behind and the charter school movement in this country are truly one of the most bipartisan screw-ups that we've ever done in our history. Because both parties are equally as dirty when it comes to the legislation and the things that have happened with this.
well, the bad part about charter school, the big thing about charter schools is it funnels money away from other public schools and is not held to the same standards.
If
And
you look
second
in Indiana,
is it's legalized segregation.
oh yeah, if you look in Indiana, because I have to correct some of my Democratic friends with this and remind them, history is a very sometimes inconvenient truth. If you look at Marion County specifically and in Indiana, in Indianapolis, charter schools were introduced into Marion County by the Democratic mayor. That's why I said it's a bipartisan thing. Both parties have tied their horses with this stuff, but I digress. So No Child Left Behind happens, and everybody's like, okay, whoa. The feds have really overreached here, too much control, and it's destroying a lot of the stuff, which rippled down into special education. So luckily, we finally get rid of it in 2015 with the Every Child Succeeds Act. And what that act did was it put more of the control back into the state's hands. It allowed the states now to make more of the decisions. We still had to have accountability, some kind of accountability measurement, which is fine. But it allowed states to go, hey, wait a minute. This is how we feel it needs to happen. So in Indiana, one of the benefits that came out of that was in 2017, legislation was finally passed that did two things. One, it mandated that the DOE had to create an alternative diploma in the state of Indiana. So which gives more kids the opportunity to get a diploma. What it also did is it also created a course of study and guidelines for what exactly a certificate of completion means.
Right.
And for those people who are watching this that don't know what that is, basically what a certificate of completion was prior to 2017 in Indiana meant your kid just went to school. They showed up, they came to school. That's really all it meant. What the new guidelines set out have done is say, no, for a kid to get a certificate in Indiana now, and the junior class that we have right now are the first ones to do this, they have to have a certain level of math classes, certain level of reading, social studies, job training.
It started creating pathways.
Yes. It actually treated kids with severe and moderate disabilities as high school students. Like, no, these are high school kids that are entitled. And where this came from was a very, probably to me, one of the most important Supreme Court decisions for us in the last 25 years, hands down. Even more important than the Raleigh decision was the Andrew decision. And for people who don't know what the Andrew decision was, just real quickly, it was a case in Colorado that involved a student with autism who wasn't meeting the IEP goals that were being developed by the school. And the parents said, hey, wait a minute. This IEP is not being designed to what they said at the time meant meaningful educational benefit. So the parents got fed up with the public schools and took their kid to a private school where he immediately started showing improvement. They were doing more rigorous work with him, higher expectations.
Right.
And the parents sued, saying, hey, they're providing the services that you didn't provide. You need to reimburse us for the public school tuition.
Right.
What the Supreme Court, originally the lower court rulings favored the school district. They were like, no, the school district reasonably did. It passes the Raleigh test.
Right.
But the Supreme Court, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually, I think, surprised a lot of people and sided with the family. And this is one of the few times in our court, and you know how rare this is, it was a unanimous decision.
Right.
And for unanimous decisions that happen in the Supreme Court, that's a pretty powerful statement.
Right.
And I'm going to re-quote what Judge Roberts said was, educational program must be appropriately ambitious in light of the circumstances.
Right.
Every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. So what this injury decision has done, and if Ben was here, I'm sure he has seen this as well. It has radically forced us to reevaluate how we write IEPs.
Right.
Are we pushing the kids forward? And I think when I look at, because I know we're kind of time-wise, we're bumping here.
We're getting close.
So I'm going to kind of leave this with this thought. I have been around special needs community for over 30 years. And what I am seeing happen right now with alternative diploma being developed, with more accountability being held for what IEP should look like, it's very encouraging to me to see the path I think that we're on. Doesn't mean we still have to stay vigilant. We still have to fight the fight, so to speak. But
Right.
I'm really encouraged on what we're seeing. And real quickly before we wrap up, I want to touch base on what a good friend of ours put on Facebook. Sandy was asking about gifted and talented.
Right.
So, okay. Gifted and talented fall under a kind of a very unique grouping under special education. Are they special education? Absolutely. It is something outside of the normal educational realm.
Yep.
So they do fall under special education. However, I'm just going to go through when I looked up on the state. Does legislation mandate gifted and talented be served? Yes. Does the state require parent-guardian involvement in decision-making or in identification?
It should.
It should, but it doesn't. And this is where you start getting into those where the gap really happens between students with disabilities and just a kid that is gifted and talented. They don't have the same protections necessarily unless they are dual identified as gifted and talented and
But they
say have a
also have a
learning
disability.
disability or autism or something else.
Right.
What I do find interesting though, when and I kind of learned some new things on this when I was researching this, while the state does provide guidelines for the identification process, it does not require specialized training in gifted education for teachers. So anybody can teach a gifted and talented class, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Right.
And does it require, but they are required to have an administrator over gifted and talented programming. So they it's acknowledged that gifted and talented requires extra supports and things, but it doesn't require that you have necessarily specialized teachers or it really is left up to a very local decision.
So, like you said earlier, I think somebody needs to go put forth that fight. So let's fight the fight.
You know, it is an interesting group. I a lot of times get asked when I've done these kind of talks now before where I think the next Supreme Court case is going to be, because that kind of seems to be how we mark history with this is how is the Supreme Court decided? Where is the next evolution of this based on that decision? And I really think access, there's maybe some minutia things with access and those things that might get addressed
right
in the court. But I really think the next big area that we're going to see, because we've already addressed the curriculum. There was a case about 5 years ago, and I can't remember the exact case off the top of my head, but there was a family in California that sued the district because they said, where is the specialized curriculum for my student? And they couldn't produce it.
Right.
Family got like $500,000 a year that the district couldn't provide the curriculum, which is why we're now seeing a trend across the country of districts adopting alternative ed curriculum and
Right.
more comprehensive stuff. But I think the next avenue where we might see a major decision case comes from not necessarily a special ed student or family, but from a non-special ed family. Especially when we get into a very touchy realm, and we really didn't talk about this a lot, of emotional disabilities.
Right.
Because that does tend to be where we do see some violent, very aggressive kids. I mean, that's just fact.
Right.
And I really think we're going to see eventually a parent step up and say, I get that child has a right to be in the classroom and have an education, but when does their behavior
interfere with my
child's right to an education as well?
Right.
So I think that's kind of where we're headed on some things. But back to the whole restaurant analogies that I've used, I always tell people, I'm tired. I don't want the doggy bag. We've gotten our seat at the table. I want the full menu. For my kids, when I advocate, I want the electives for my kids. I want the English. I want the math. I'm tired of us sitting back and taking the doggy bag and the scraps of whatever. Oh, well, we can offer you this.
Right.
No, they're high school kids. They should get what every other high school kids get.
Right.
Which goes to the whole fair is not equal, equal is not fair argument.
Right. All right. So we're going to have to end there. We're a little bit out of time. But some of the stuff that we were not able to cover, we might have to hit in another episode later on down the line. Because one of the things that I wanted to cover, but we didn't get a chance to, was least restrictive environment. Because that's a touchy subject where, like you said, where the people that have that don't have students that are special ed going, hey, where does the line draw where their rights are interfering with my students' rights? But that's a topic for another discussion, which we could spend a whole show just about least restrictive environment. So,
in Indiana, the law, just real quick, the law in Indiana has really brought that even more to the conversation, because with the certificate of completion course of study, one of the things in that law said that they are to be pushed into general ed classes and things as much as possible.
Right.
So we are seeing that push again, and it's that whole pendulum thing, which.
Yep.
Let me know. Be happy to come back.
All right. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Make sure you hit our Facebook page, History's Three Sides. Make suggestions on what kind of topics you want to hear. Next week, we're going to start with a two-part series talking about the Constitution, religion, freedom of religion, and separation of church and state. And does separation of church and state actually exist in the Constitution? That's a question some people have asked. So We're going to get into that next week, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you, Chris, again for joining us this week for our History 3 Sides special education discussion, and we will see you all next week. Have a good week, Chris.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.